I used to get into a lot of fights with my stepmother. Things were pretty crappy at home ever since she married my dad. I asked my mom if I could come stay with her for a while, but it seemed she was too busy to house me. It really sucked, honestly. Things just got more and more difficult, and it eventually all came to a head when my stepmom accused me of stealing something from her. Of course, I hadn't done this, but my dad immediately believed her over me, and we got into a huge fight about it. I really couldn't take it anymore. After they went to sleep, I packed up a duffel bag and a tiny bit of money I had, and left for a couple of nights on my own. I was able to sleep at a friend's house at first, but I was only 16, so that really didn't last very long at all. After about 4 or 5 nights, I was faced with the harsh reality of sleeping on the streets. It scared me for sure, but not enough to make me go home after that big argument. My first night on the streets, though, was probably worse than you can ever imagine. It was just a complete nightmare. I didn't really sleep at all. I tried to sleep at the train station at first, but the doors were locked, so I slept outside instead. I felt myself drifting off a few times, but I really couldn't get any sleep. I did have a little bit of money on me, so the next day I took the train into the city. I figured there would be more places to sleep there. It turned out I was right. The following night, I found myself holed up in an alleyway, and I curled up next to the garbage can. I actually did manage to sleep for a while before I felt a sharp tapping wake me up. I jumped and grabbed my bag. There was a girl there who also looked homeless. She was fairly nice actually though, and told me it was dangerous to sleep in such a place. She told me there was a nicer place nearby where people were squatting, and she asked me if I wanted to accompany her. Although I was scared at first, I realized it might be better to get some sleep with other people around. I went there with her. I followed her there. There were a lot of people squatting in this old home actually. It seemed kind of weird actually. People were grouped together in circles talking quietly. I really didn't know how much more comfortable I was going to be there than in the alleyway, but she took me into a room that only 2 other guys were in. It seemed she knew them all, and they all welcomed me with friendly smiles. They wanted to know if I wanted to hang out. I found out a few minutes later she would be doing heroin with them. I let them know I was only interested in sleeping. I was not into the whole idea of getting hooked on drugs. I was so tired though that them doing heroin in the same room didn't even bother me. I figured I wasn't going to do it, so it was no big deal. I went into the corner for a little bit. I actually watched what they were doing. I was tired, yeah, but I guess now I was also a bit scared of them and curious about how they were doing this. It was hard to watch, especially when the girl did it. I mean, she had been nice before, but now she was just acting all weird and crazy. I liked her because she had helped me, but I didn't want to be anywhere near her in this moment. Watching them all shoot that stuff up was really hard, but after a while, I actually managed to doze off a bit. Later though, I felt someone up against me, which woke me up almost immediately. I opened my eyes and it was the girl from before. She smiled at me, and I did too. I was just about to close my eyes when she rubbed my pants a bit. We were both too out of it to do anything though, so she fell asleep right on top of me. Later on though, I felt someone tugging at my arm or doing something with it. It was really annoying. I thought it must have been the girl who had woken up since though. I tried to keep the sleep going, but I woke up immediately when I felt a sharp pain shoot through my arm. Opening my eyes, I saw a much older man standing over me. I hadn't seen it before. Right in my face though, he had pulled my shirt sleeve up and put some sort of band on my arm. It only took a few moments for me to realize this guy was going to shoot me up with heroin while I was sleeping. "What the hell are you doing?" I screamed. I tried to pull my arm away from him. "I'm gonna kill you like you killed her," he said, motioning towards the girl. I looked over at her only to see she was lying with her head against the wall, clearly breathing perfectly fine. I pointed out to the man that she was still alive, but the man grabbed hold of my arm even tighter. Most of what happened next was almost a blur. He had a needle at the ready, but I resisted as hard as I could. Eventually, I got a good kick on the guy, and he let go of me with his hand. I grabbed my bag and sprinted out of the house. I kept running until I found a place to hide until the following morning. The following day, I found a shelter for runaway teens and stayed there for as long as they would let me. It was a long time, and there was no happy ending to be found anytime soon. I never went back to my parents, and I didn't see them for years, actually. I lived in shelters, hopping back and forth, until I eventually got a job and then an apartment, and made something with my life in the end. Things got really bad after my dad died. My mom fell into a deep depression for years. She ended up marrying this awful guy who just used her all the time and hated us kids. It really sucked because she would have never given a guy like him the time of day beforehand. Things got really rough for me and my brothers and sisters. As the oldest, I did my best to try and protect the others, but it didn't really work. When I was 15, my stepdad hit my younger brother, and he and I got into an all-out fist fight. My mom immediately took his side when she came home from work and kicked me out of the house. I literally had nowhere to go. We had moved a lot of times after my dad passed away, and I really didn't have any good friends because of this. We didn't have any family nearby either. We lived a bit out in the country, so it wasn't like there were shelters or anything nearby. I spent a couple of days wandering around in the hills. Actually, it was the only thing I could think to do. There were multiple abandoned buildings I'd found that I could sleep in for a little while. There were also plenty of creeks with fresh water to drink. This was in the late spring too, so there were some apple trees I could steal apples from. You might be surprised about how I didn't run into any people for a long time. Hell, it was surprising to me too. There were tons of hills though, and they went on and on and on. Even with nobody around to worry about though, it was still hell. I had to sleep with a tiny blanket I had packed and used my jacket for a pillow. I slept on the splintered floors of these abandoned little sheds, or whatever they happened to be. The whole time I was worried someone would stumble down from the mountains and catch me or something. One evening, I was sitting back in a small building, reading a book by flashlight. That was when I heard a strange sound, like a man groaning or something. I got up and looked out the window on the door of the shed. It was extremely dark outside, but I did just about manage to make out a shadowy figure of someone standing about 50 yards away. I quickly turned off my light. I had put a padlock on the door. I had brought one with me for safety when I got kicked out. I had always planned to sleep in these abandoned houses if that ever happened, so I knew I would need some extra protection in the form of that padlock. I watched the man from inside the shed. He was walking around, but mostly in my direction. Now, this shed was quite old, and you could tell no one had used it in decades. This guy was coming right towards it though, and he also seemed to have something ready in his hand. It was long, but I couldn't quite tell what it was. It might have been a gun or a particularly large knife, who knows what. When I realized the guy was making a beeline towards the shed now, I did the only thing I could think to do. I took my blanket and went over to the farthest corner of the shed. I hid under the blanket and piled some dirt and random debris on top of me. I hoped in the dark he would not be able to distinguish me from my surroundings. I was too afraid to look out of my blanket to even see if he was there though. It felt like a long time passed. I was just about to peek out from underneath when suddenly I heard some more sounds, as if someone was trying to bust open the door. They began pulling extremely hard, and I heard the lock jiggling back and forth. I began to get very scared. It was even worse though when the man began slamming something against the door. I almost crapped my pants as the pounding got fiercer and fiercer. He didn't begin yelling or anything, but rather started speaking in a strange gibberish I could not understand. I was scared and shivering. Whatever he was saying, he was clearly in some sort of tranquil fury. After a while, he stopped pounding. I thought he'd finally decided to give up, but he began to kick on the door and started yelling this time. I heard a gunshot and an awful guttural sound. I found out later that was a bullet going through the wood of the door. He shot the door several more times. I was crying silently in the shed, hoping he couldn't hear me. Not long after this flurry of shots, the man stopped pounding on the door. I was damn impressed with how strong that old rotting door was. That came later though. After he stopped pounding on the door, he must have walked away because it got real quiet. I waited there for what seemed like hours. It might have actually been hours now that I think about it. I thought maybe the guy was the owner of the land in the shed or something. Why else would this guy be out in the middle of the night in the mountains? Maybe he was some crazy hermit or wanderer or something. Whatever it was scary as hell. When I finally had the nerve to crawl out, I peeked through the window and saw that no one was there. Although I was terrified, I stayed in that shed for the rest of the night. The following day, I went home. Turns out my mom had been looking for me because her new husband had hit one of my other siblings while I was out. I guess she didn't realize that he was lying and kicked him out after. I can't lie to you, it was extremely hard to forgive her, but I eventually did so, and I was just happy to be home at the end of the day. There was a time when I left home as a teenager. I don't want to get into the specifics too much. It was a real nasty time, and my parents seemed real nasty to me too. Looking back, it was probably just as much my fault though as it was theirs. I was a bit of a jerk. Anyway, we got into this big, huge fight, and I told them I was going to leave. They said, "Well, fine, see what it's like out there on your own." I decided to do just that. I thought everything would be fine. I went to live with a guy named Chaz. He had been a pretty cool guy in all the time I'd known him. He lived alone with his father, who was barely ever home anyway. Seemed like the ideal situation to me. They lived out in a rural area, in a beautiful home. We knew each other really well, so he let me crash on his bedroom floor without much fuss. That was fine with me. I really didn't know much about Chaz's father though. What was stranger was that Chaz wouldn't tell me much about him either. I even asked him one time what his dad did for a living, and he basically said he didn't even know. I found that especially odd, but he said they didn't really spend much time together. He told me he pretty much had to raise himself, as his dad was basically never there. He just gave him money whenever he asked for it. Anything else was pretty much all up to him. Eventually, his father did show up, and I ended up having a weird little interaction with him. He seemed to have known I had been there for a good 2 months before I had this freaky experience. Chaz and I were up late watching movies in the living room when his dad just suddenly came home. He just ripped open the door without even saying anything. I was a bit afraid of the way the man was stomping around. I thought he might have been angry that I was staying there with him, but he just left the room. When he came back around, he was carrying some sort of semi-automatic rifle with him. He told us in an angry voice to either go to Chaz's room or stay away from the windows and get down. I wanted to run and hide immediately, but Chaz didn't want to go to his room and locked it with several different locks. I watched him carefully, seeing him pacing in front of the house back and forth. After a while, I saw a light of what seemed to be several pickup trucks pulling up to the home. The light shone in through the living room window and nearly blinded me. I asked Chaz if we should get the hell out of there right now. He simply told me not to worry about it, and this had happened several times before. It was likely not going to turn into anything. I heard Chaz's dad screaming some things at the guys in the trucks. I heard them yelling back at him. I couldn't really understand what any of them were saying though. I took Chaz's word that this wasn't that big a deal, but it wasn't easy to do that, especially when I heard a few gunshots ring out in the night. After a few seconds, multiple gunshots started ringing out. I jumped up in surprise, but Chaz shoved me back down. He said they were simply warning shots, and I shouldn't get so uppity about something like this. Happens all the time, he said. A couple of moments later, an absolute hellfire of gunshots rang out. Apparently, those were just shots in the air too. I mean, they must have been, because they didn't seem to actually hit anything, and no one was crying out in pain or seemed to be shot. Chaz was eerily calm throughout this entire thing. That was probably the most unnerving thing to me. His dad was out on the front yard having a gun standoff with several armed men in pickup trucks, and he just sat there eating popcorn and watching a movie. I don't really have words for how scary this was. There was a long while of more gunshots, and eventually the truck sped off in a hurry. Chaz's dad came back inside with his gun. He didn't say anything to either of us. He just walked down to the basement, and that was the last time I saw him all night. I asked Chaz to explain what the hell just happened, and he seemed pretty disinterested. All he would tell me was that his dad worked with some guys, and they often had clashes like this. He said it wasn't unusual or even uncommon. No one ever really got shot too badly or hurt though. He told me to just ignore it the next time it happened. I had to stay with Chaz for a long time because of circumstances, so this incident actually did repeat itself several times. They never told me what exactly was going on with these armed standoffs, but as weird as it seems, as it went on, I really did start to become more like Chaz and just ignore the whole situation. It was pretty surreal. My name is Nikki, and I had a really weird experience back when I was in college. It still haunts me to this day. When I was a freshman in college, I didn't get to experience the college experience the way many do. I didn't go to any of the football games, even though I'm a huge football fan. I didn't date any guys, and I didn't even go to a single party. I was so thoroughly concerned with succeeding academically that I put 100% of my focus into my schoolwork. It really paid off, and I did get straight A's all year, but I really felt like I was missing out on what college was supposed to be. As a sophomore, I decided to take part more socially. Not having made many college friends, this wasn't very easy to get into. I attended a few football games by myself and tried to join some various clubs. I really had a problem connecting with a lot of the other members though. Where I was successful in making friends, however, was in class. Several classes, when we were put together for group work or whatever, I was able to really connect with my fellow students. By October, in my first sophomore semester, I was successful in making quite a few friends, and I got invited to a Halloween party. I was nervous going, and I guess I was right to be. Although I got to talk with a lot of my friends, it was only for short periods of time. It was a pretty wild party as it turned out, and they had plenty of other people to talk to as well. There was this one guy who was dressed up as what I guess was some sort of anime character. I wasn't really sure. He kept looking at me from across the room before eventually coming up to me. He said his name was Chris and asked me what I was drinking. I was having a rum and coke, and he started talking about how much he liked that. He offered to go and get me a new drink. I was so happy at having someone talking to me that I accepted right away. He left, and a few minutes later came back with 2 rum and cokes. He handed me mine, and he started drinking his. After a while, he seemed to be getting hit really hard from the alcohol. He began slurring his words strongly and eventually started swaying from being dizzy. I assumed he was either a real lightweight or he had been drinking a lot beforehand. When he slumped against the wall and seemed ready to pass out, I got really concerned. I didn't know what to do in this situation. I sought out one of my friends. I told them he had only had a single drink. They called an ambulance just in case. I'll never forget what happened in that moment. We laid him down on his side and went to check if he was alright by checking his vitals. They just so happened to run their hands over his pocket where they found he had a bottle of Rohypnol hidden away. It was in his system as well when they did tests after. I had an idea about what happened after that. Rohypnol is a common date drug, you see. I think Chris had gone to get drinks, and both drinks were rum and cokes. He had roofied one of them, intending to give it to me, but he ended up forgetting which one it was. He ended up drinking the one with the drugs in it himself. I'll never forget how lucky I was that night.